All right, welcome. In this video, I want to talk about the field of artificial life, which is a companion field to the field of artificial intelligence. The field of artificial life was first founded in 1986. There was a workshop that was held at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. It was organized by this gentleman here, Chris Langton. The workshop was called the Workshop on the Synthesis and Simulation of Living Systems, and this has become the first artificial life conference. At this conference, Chris Langton outlined some of what he thought were some of the important principles of artificial life, and two of them I've included here. The first is that artificial life is got a hypothetical nature to it. That is, we are certainly interested in studying living systems as they exist, biological systems as they exist here on Earth, but we are also interested in studying life as it could be. And that's just so when we make a simulation, we might be inspired by a natural phenomena, a natural biological phenomena that we want to study, but we might also be inspired by just our own curiosity or hypotheses about what other kinds of life might exist. And then fundamentally, when we do create simulations of living systems, there is sort of a question if we do treat those simulations also as living systems, then indeed we have created a new form of life, something that is different than the biological life that inspired it. So that's one of the key features of artificial life and artificial life research, is that we are not constrained by how life actually is. That's something that biologists are maybe more focused on. We're able to expand out into the hypothetical region of that search space. Now, the second important principle is this idea of functionalism. And this is a philosophical belief that you can have about certain things or properties. The idea of functionalism is what makes you a particular kind of thing is that you behave like it, that you function like it, that you have a particular function, and that function is how we identify you in that way. There are certainly lots of properties or roles that we would assign based on function alone. So, for instance, being a doctor, a medical doctor, is something that is a factor of your function. If you actually perform the role of being a doctor, then you are a doctor, and that's what makes a doctor, is performing those particular roles. There's sort of a famous old saying, which is sort of stupid is as stupid does. It's kind of a weird saying. When I was a child and someone would say that to me, I said, I don't really know what that means. But what the meaning of that sentence is that what makes you stupid is doing stupid things. And that's what defines stupidity. And there's sort of I guess it was intended usually as a mean thing, but I think there's a nice way to phrase that, which is there are not stupid people. There are just people that do maybe stupid things. And if we focus on the act or the behavior instead of the person, that can make us treat them with more compassion and empathy. So that's sort of the idea behind functionalism. And Chris Langton, basically, we could attribute this belief to him about life, that life, what makes things living, is a matter of their function, the behavior, the things that they do to carry out their, the important roles of their life, whether that be, find food or energy or reproduce or other things that might be in your life. It's that process of going about that behavior and finding the food and replenishing your resources and reproducing that makes you a living thing, not something else. And what could be the other thing? Well, the other thing might be what you're made of. So maybe you're made up of biological bits, and some folks might think that biological bits are what make you a living thing. And if you have biological bits, you're a living thing. And if you don't, you are not. And while that's a perfectly okay belief to hold, and you may even have good, strong reasons for why you might want to hold that belief, Chris Langton disagreed with that. He had his own reasons for believing the opposite is true, that life is not just a property of the kinds of thing you are, but how that thing is organized and behaves or carries out behavior to maintain itself. And so using that idea, that kind of leads into the other property of hypothetical nature that allows us to imagine, well, we can observe life here on Earth. This is life as it is in front of us, but we can maybe generalize from the function of life. We look at all living things and try and figure out what is the function that these living things carry out. And then if we observe that function in something else, we should attribute life to that something else as well. And certainly this is the way that, many biologists may disagree with Chris Langton, but there are many that also may agree with him as well and say, yeah, if we see living like things in something else, we might call that life. And that certainly underpins debates about whether a virus is a living thing. And maybe I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. So these two properties help to frame what artificial life research is about. We're interested in studying life, not just as it is, but how it could be. And then we're focusing on the function of life, the things that make life, allows it to achieve its living state. And usually, and I'm a researcher in this area, I like to focus on certain things like foraging, which is the act of going out and finding resources and food in your environment so that you can replenish your resources, and then reproduction. And built into reproduction, of course, is the process of evolution, which is something that's also central to artificial life research. And again, the idea is maybe if something that is evolving, undergoing a process similar to biological evolution, that might be because it's alive, similar to biological life forms. So these ideas, again, are central in this field. So as I mentioned, the first conference was held in 1986. Following that, 1987, and following that in 1990 was when the A-Life conference series was launched officially. And since 1990, there has been a artificial life conference held every year. It started by alternating between two conferences, the Artificial Life Conference, which traditionally was held in North America, and then the European Conference on Artificial Life, which again traditionally was held in Europe. And I believe it was about 2018 or maybe 2019 when these two conferences actually merged together. And finally, well, we only have one conference now. We just call it the Artificial Life Conference. It's held every year, and it still sort of moves around the world. Sometimes this year's conference will be in Japan, for instance. In addition to the Artificial Life Conference, there's also the Journal of Artificial Life. There's also the International Society of Artificial Life that is sort of joins artificial life researchers together to help draw us into conferences and help us publish in this journal. So artificial life research can be divided into a couple categories, 3 categories roughly. The first one, the one that I do my research in primarily, is we might call it soft A-Life, and that's where we're going to focus on creating living things in software or in simulation. And this is maybe one of the probably the largest area of artificial life research. And one of the reasons for that is it's easy to do. It's actually quite simple to do some simulations in in the computer, in the software, instead of having to maybe build actual artificial robots, so artificial life forms in a physical sense, or there's also other challenges related to manipulating real life into different kinds of forms that we might call artificial life. So this area here is called soft A-Life, and I've just got a couple examples here of different simulations that I've carried out. This is an interesting network-based simulation where agents had to find one another to reproduce and mate and so on. This was an interesting one. I mentioned my ant simulation in a previous video. I've got some evolutionary robotics simulation going on in this one. This is where agents will use an artificial neural network to scan their environment and try and find this food pellet and go out and eat it. Down here I've got a simulation of a pack of wolves hunting some caribou, and there's a weak caribou will the wolves be able to catch the caribou? And again, in another video, I mentioned my domestication of wheat simulation, which I have going up here. So most of my simulations are web-based simulations, meaning you can find them on the web and you can just run them. They're usually lightweight so that they can be run on the web. And again, those are some of the benefits of doing soft A-Life research, is being able to work in lightweight environments. So I kind of hinted at this. If you're, the alternative to doing soft A-Life research is doing hard A-Life research. And here we just mean hard as in hardware. And so it's often you can start some of your evolutionary robotics simulations. For instance, I pointed out a simulation of evolutionary robotics over there. Well, after you got some neural networks that you think work pretty well inside a simulation, you might take that neural network and make it a controller for a physical robot. And then there are certain challenges bridging that gap between software and hardware that are certainly interesting and worth studying, but it allows you to then maybe continue that evolutionary experiment now in the real world with real robots. And that's certainly another interesting dimension of A-Life research. And then another area which is really interesting, but also kind of expensive and time consuming to carry out, is wet A-Life, which is the idea of using biochemistry or the biological life forms that we already have, and then maybe manipulating them in some way to change their characteristics, change their behavior. This is focused a lot on biology and biochemistry, but there are even some wet A-Life that go all the way down to just simple chemical molecules, seeing if we can get molecules to behave in really interesting, cool ways. This might be proto-life, if you want to call it that. The different kinds of replicating molecules that may have existed prior to organizing themselves into a biological life form. So all of that research is also being carried out. Again, a little more expensive because you have to actually do it in physical labs. And as I mentioned in previous videos, sometimes working with these mean waiting for generations to go on. Maybe you're working on, fruit flies, as I mentioned, where a generation might take you about a day to get a generation of fruit flies. That's pretty quick as far as generations go, but again, it might take you, 50 days to get 50 generations. So it's a little bit more time-consuming research, but still very interesting research. One characterizing aspect of artificial life research that is also really important is artificial life. Like artificial intelligence, we sometimes, as artificial life researchers, we sometimes think that we are focused on the same goal as artificial intelligence research, which is we're trying to build an intelligent life form. And that sort of puts both sides of the perspective in focus. So we want to make a life form. Well, what makes a life form is often that it's intelligent. And there's a hypothesis or a thesis that exists in the artificial life world, or at least we in the artificial life world like to assert it often. And this is what I call the life intelligence hypothesis, or the life intelligence thesis, which is that wherever you find life, you will also find intelligence, and then vice versa. Wherever you find intelligence, you will also find life. Now, this is a thesis or a hypothesis. It's not been proven or disproven. It's also possible that the way that I have just stated it is not something that really could be proven or not. It is more of a commitment that you might have, a philosophical commitment that living things are intelligent things and intelligent things are living things. And if you're committed to that belief, as I am, then you might believe that studying living things and studying intelligent things are kind of the same thing. And when we think about artificial intelligence, the study of trying to create a artificially intelligent creature or life form, that usually artificial intelligence researchers are often focused on the human side of intelligence. And we might call this a top-down approach to intelligence, which is we're going to start by trying to create something that has a human level intelligence. That's the top. And we'll work our way down to other kinds of intelligence. Well, A-Life tends to focus on the opposite direction. We like to go bottom up. We want to start with some very simple intelligences, which might be the intelligence of our eusocial insects, like these ants that are depicted here. Or we might have even simpler. I mentioned bacteria or even simple chemicals that interact. We might focus on how do they interact, how do they get together, how do they make their living behavior work, their intelligent behavior work. And if we can figure that out in some way, it might help us understand intelligence. So studying simple life might allow us to understand intelligence. And of course, any good research that has kind of both a bottom-up and a top-down approach, it is valuable to do both directions and hopefully meet somewhere in the middle. And in fact, we're seeing modern payoffs from exactly that very thing. So on the one hand, we want to have high-level reasoning AI devices like our ChatGPTs and so on. But on the other hand, we want them to be able to have low-level perception abilities. We maybe detect what an image is and know what that image is. And combining those together, so on the one hand, the low-level image detection is sort of more of an A-lifey kind of problem, and then the high level might be reasoning about that image to try and make a text description of that image. And the merger of those two directions is what's really helping draw. Only one of those directions wouldn't be able to create the helpful tools that we have today. We needed both of them to meet in the middle. And this is also very much true in robotics. We use lots of low level neural networks that we might train or evolve in certain ways to control limbs and control sensors and whatnot. But then we take the data from those sensors and controls and put them into maybe more high-level reasoning, so that or pathfinding or planning, so that our agents can do high-level tasks while also still using those low-level competencies that they may have. All right, so I also want to talk just a little bit of, what counts as a living system then? So, and here, as an artificial life researcher, I might give you a particular perspective on what a living system is, but we can also rely on definitions from biology to help us, of course, and that should be our first and, that should be our first avenue of exploration. So here I wanted to mention that there are competing definitions of life, even among biologists, and not all biologists are necessarily going to agree. And this is actually common in science, and it's also not necessarily a problem for science, which is we accept that we tend to use different definitions of things, and as long as we agree ahead of time which definitions we are going to use, then we can still have conversations. And why do we often have different definitions is because we have different purposes for them. We have different reasons why we define things in different ways. And when we are committed to purpose A, we might use definition A. And when we're committed to purpose B, we might use definition B. Now, this definition of living system that I'm going to give you here is one that has sort of been extrapolated from lots of different definitions and tried to gather together some of the key features that are common in all of them, and then maybe not include some that are not common in all of them, so that maybe only show up in a few of them. We'll leave those on the side. So the first property of living systems is that the system must be some organization of component subsystems. Now, that's a fairly simple requirement. Now remember back to our video on what is a system or what is a complex system. All systems satisfy this organization property. And so again, this might be fairly simple for us to admit, but all we're really saying here is a living system is a system. Now, there's the technical word here, homeostasis, just means that the system, the living system, whatever it might be, is in charge of maintaining itself, that it has to keep itself alive, that there's not something else keeping it alive. And again, if you think of your favorite living organism, certainly that's something that's true. We have our own built-in life support system that help us stay alive. Now, of course, if we were left completely alone, would we be a little helpless? I certainly would be, but that's not exactly what we mean. We mean, do you have a mouth to process your food? Do you have a way to expel your waste? Do you have muscles to move your limbs to get around, and so on? Those are the things that you're using to maintain your system. Among them, also some automatic controls like your heart beating or your breathing and so on. So these are the behaviors of the system that help maintain the system. Okay, so another property of living things is that they have a metabolism. The system must spend energy in some way, and it must get that energy in some way. Now, this is just accepting the fact that these living systems have to live in the universe, and the universe has certain laws about how energy is expended, and if you need to expend energy, you need to go find more energy, you need to go get it. So there's sort of two sides of this metabolic process here that we can focus on. On the one hand, there's energy out in the universe, in the environment around the living system, and there's a task, a macro task you might call it, where the living agent must go out and find that food, those energy resources, and consume them, whatever they might be. But then there's a secondary part of the metabolism, which is the sort of the micro level, is once I've found that food and I've munched it up with my big old munchers and I've swallowed it, I now need to have sort of a biochemical metabolism that breaks down that energy and converts it into a form that I can use. And then also through our bloodstream or some other kind of circulatory system, we need to deliver that energy out to the component parts of our body that actually needs it. So that's also considered to be part of the metabolism. Now, what I've just described is a very complex metabolism that humans have, of course, but all that's required here to be a living system is that you have some kind of metabolism. You exist in the universe. That means you need to get energy, and where do you get that energy from? That's the main requirement here. So another property of living systems is that we typically grow, and that the way that's expressed here is that if you have some excess energy, so you've been doing that metabolism business, capturing energy, maybe you've got some extra energy, well, then you're going to use that to grow. Okay, it says here to create additional components, and when I see it written that way, I'm thinking more like a tree, maybe, where a tree grows and says, oh gee, I'm going to get another branch over here, or maybe some more leaves over here, or maybe another flowering bud, or whatever it might be. I'm going to create more of them. Now, as human beings, we don't typically think, oh gee, I had a little extra energy today, I'm going to grow another arm or an extra pair of eyes or something. That would be cool, I guess, but that's not really how our living systems work. But that doesn't mean we don't grow in this same way. The additional components we typically make are just more cells of the same kind. So maybe more skin cells to let our skin grow, or more muscle cells to let our muscles grow, or more bone cells to let our bones grow. And certainly, until you're an adult, you do a lot of that growing. And then even once you are an adult, there's still sort of the regular maintenance growth that needs to occur as things die and need to, skin cells die off, new ones need to be created. Certainly our brains are really powerful. They grow new neurons all the time to help wire them up as well. So there's lots of things in our system, even as adults, that still continue to grow. Another interesting relevant property of life is the ability to adapt. Now, we don't say how adaptive you are here. So, humans are very adaptive. We can live in all kinds of different environments because of our culture, in most cases. But, you might think of a very simple organism, might not be quite as adaptive as us, but may still have some adaptive ability. And again, adaptive just means the ability to change in some way over time in response usually to some changes in your environment. So maybe that means you're going to change how you behave in that environment. That's typically, we call that learning, right? So I learned that this behavior was bad, and so now I'm not going to do it anymore. I learned this behavior helped me get food, so I'm going to try and do it more if I can. But you don't only have to change your behavior, you can grow. So growth, we mentioned earlier, changing your shape in some way, changing, and plants, which don't have a lot of behavior, they don't got muscles like us, they can't do a lot of moving around and do different actions. They tend to do the same things, but what they do have a lot of flexibility or plasticity with is their growth. And you may have seen lots of cool images of trees growing around obstructions in their environment, and that's just showing how they can adapt to their environment through growth, okay, even if they don't have behavior necessarily to adapt. So this was kind of hinted at in the last one. Adaptation comes as response to something that happened in your environment. Well, that's another key property of living systems, is that they respond to their environment with behavior usually. So it says here the system's behaviors respond to information in the environment. And it says here, so as to seek resources and avoid harm. Now, I want us to focus on this particular definition because it really parallels the agent definition we had a couple of videos ago, which is the agent definition said something about, maybe sensing and acting on its environment so as to pursue its agenda. That's just a different way of saying what we've got going on here. Okay, we've got the system's behavior responds to information in the environment, senses the environment, its behaviors mean it is acting on the environment, and this so as to seek resources and avoid harm is to pursue the agenda of the agent. So this one I really see as just saying, okay, living systems, remember up above the organization said living systems must be systems. This one's saying more. This one's saying living systems are actually not just systems, they're agents. And agents are systems, so they are a special kind of system is what we're saying here. Of course we are, because we're saying what a living system is. A living system is a special kind of system, and one of the things about living systems is they are agents. That's what this one's saying, they're agents. Okay, so again, the first one's saying we're a system. The second one really just saying we're self-organizing system. The next one's characterizing that we have some relationship to our environment. And the last one basically saying, hey, we are an agent in our environment. We're situated in our environment and we interact with it in order to pursue our agenda. And then the last criteria, and it's often added as a last criteria because some people like to debate about it a little bit, is the idea of reproduction. So the system should be able to, growth, remember, was with my extra energy, I grow myself, I make extra components to myself, but reproduction is saying, okay, now I take that extra energy and I don't make more of myself, I make a copy of myself, I make another offspring, something else that isn't myself. It's a new entity, it's a new organism, it's this new living system, it's this new agent. That thing's going to go out on its own and pursue its own agenda that's different than mine, even though being biologically related, we might have a similar agenda. Mine is focused on me and yours is focused on you. So this is going to be a new agent. So again, reproduction is a very common one to include as another property of living systems. And certainly when we go out and look at biological systems, the vast majority of them satisfy this condition. But I say the vast majority of them because there is a small category of them that are, that's viruses, that are interesting because viruses are not capable of reproducing themselves. Again, I don't want to get into all the weeds here, but this is certainly a debatable thing that some folk will say, well, viruses can't reproduce themselves. Why is that? Viruses need to hijack the reproductive tools of another cell. So a virus by itself, you may have heard that this virus is inert. That means it's not doing anything. Unless it can inject itself into a cell, it just sits there and doesn't do anything. And for some reasons, folks think, okay, that means it's not alive. If it can't reproduce itself, it's not alive. But viruses can reproduce as long as they do hijack the reproductive system of some other cell. And for that reason, others will say, yeah, but they kind of look alive, and we kind of and then, as I said, I don't want to get in that debate. I personally think viruses are alive, but I also don't have any, I'm not betting any money on it. There's nothing that it matters to me if you call them alive or dead, okay? And if they're not alive, if they're not a living system, then they're another kind of system that's very close by the living system. And the differences between those don't matter much to me, but they might matter to someone else. They might matter to biologists. And for that reason, that debate might continue. And again, as I said, I'm not going to weigh in too heavily on it. Now, with all that said, I have put some of these properties together, and in my own kind of interpretation, I want to maybe define what a living system is. So I'll maybe finish here with my definition of a living system. So a living system is a dynamically persistent, self-sustaining agent capable of reproduction. I'm trying to just capture all of these ideas together in one. I guess that's a pretty long phrase there. But dynamically persistent, what does that mean? That means the thing dynamically means it changes over time. Persistent means it exists or it persists over time. So it occupies a period of time. It has a start time and an end time, and through that time it persists. And again, most living things satisfy those. It changes over time and persists. It is self-sustaining. So what keeps it persisting is itself. Now remember, as we said when we discussed homeostasis and stuff, that doesn't mean it's 100% control over everything. That just means it is the one that's responsible for maintaining its own organization. Now we said it was an agent. Remember, that brings in the response to stimuli, so that brings in a lot of definitional work there. And then I just had to add that last one, that it is capable of reproduction. And we sometimes give names to things, that agents that are capable of reproduction. Richard Dawkins, who's a famous evolutionary biologist, he calls them replicators. And we'll talk more about those when we start talking about evolution. But for now, I will leave you with this as my final definition of a living system. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to artificial life. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.